Shaq was just taking a walk when a white woman pointed at a 13-year-old black boy and shouted, "He's stealing that scooter." The kid was sketching in a notebook, but that didn't matter to her. People stopped. Tension rose. A 911 call was already in motion. What happened next? It didn't just shut her down. It sparked a movement, flipped the narrative, and left the entire city asking one question: who really didn't belong there? Stay till the end, because this one doesn't end how you think. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. "Excuse me, is that your scooter?" the woman asked, her voice tight, her eyes narrowing like he'd just rolled up on a crime scene. Jaden looked up from his sketch pad, squinting against the late afternoon sun. His pencil hovered midair as the question hung awkwardly between them. A breeze rustled the leaves around him, but her stare didn't waver. She wasn't just curious. She was already convinced. He blinked. "Yeah, it's mine." She crossed her arms, lips pursed. "Do you live around here?" Jaden sat straighter on the bench, glancing at the orange scooter parked beside him. "I'm just waiting for my uncle. I come here after school sometimes." Her gaze traveled from his scuffed sneakers to his curly hair and deep brown skin, then back to the scooter like it had sprouted legs and walked there on its own. "Well, I've never seen you around here, and that scooter looks expensive." Jaden's hands tightened around his sketch pad. "Ma'am, I'm not bothering anyone." "Exactly, just sitting here, like you're hiding something." She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police." Jaden's stomach flipped. "What? Why?" "I said you're acting suspicious. You're in a neighborhood that doesn't match your profile." "Profile?" His voice cracked, equal parts confusion and rising fear. "I'm 13. I have a school uniform on." She waved a hand. "And you could be hiding anything in that backpack, or under the bench, or in your hoodie." Jaden swallowed hard, heart racing now. "You can check my stuff. I'm literally just drawing." But she wasn't listening. She turned away slightly, already speaking into the phone. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious minor, possibly armed. He's making me feel unsafe." The last words shattered the air like glass. People walking dogs, jogging, pushing strollers, all began to slow down. Some looked. A few stopped. One man pulled out his phone, recording quietly. Jaden's mouth went dry. He stood slowly, not wanting to appear sudden. The sketch pad now held like a fragile shield. "Please don't do this," he said softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." She lowered her phone from her ear. "Then you shouldn't be afraid." He stared at her tight jaw, her raised chin, her sense of authority like armor. And for the first time in his young life, realized what people meant when they said the world wouldn't always see him for who he really was. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't reach for it. He just stood there frozen as she repeated louder, "He's making me feel unsafe." "Dispatch, I need officers here immediately," Miss Waverly said, pacing near the bench like she was standing at the scene of a hostage crisis. Her voice rang out louder than necessary, drawing eyes from every direction. A man jogging by slowed his pace, earbuds pulled out. A woman walking her golden retriever paused mid-step, brows knitting with concern. Jaden took a small step back, still clutching his sketch pad. His mouth felt dry, but he forced out the words. "Ma'am, I told you, I'm just waiting for my uncle. He picks me up from here after school." Miss Waverly turned toward him like she'd just heard a threat. "Stay right where you are," she snapped. "Don't even think about running." Jaden blinked, confused. "I'm not." She turned back to the phone. "He's acting aggressive now," she told the dispatcher. "He keeps moving closer. I don't feel safe." Jaden's heart thudded so hard it felt like it echoed in his ears. "That's not true. I haven't done anything." "You need to calm down," she said with exaggerated slowness, like she was speaking to a wild animal. "You're making this worse for yourself." A middle-aged couple nearby paused, sensing the tension in the air. The man muttered, "What's going on?" and reached for his phone. Jaden took another breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Look, I didn't take anything. That's my scooter. I've been sitting here drawing." But it didn't matter. Her eyes weren't seeing him. They were seeing a headline, a threat, a story she was crafting in real time. "I can describe him," she said into the phone. "Black male, around 13 or 14. Hoodie, backpack, possibly armed." Jaden felt like the ground had just tilted under him. His legs wobbled, but he stood his ground. His phone buzzed in his pocket. For a split second, he froze, unsure whether reaching for it would make her scream. Carefully, Slowly, he pulled it out. Uncle Terrence's name glowed on the screen. He answered with shaking fingers. Uncle T? Jay, I'm 2 minutes away. You good? Jaden looked up. Miss Waverly was still on the phone, still spinning her tale. I don't know, he whispered. She called the cops. There was a pause on the other end. Then, I'll be there in 60 seconds. Stay calm. Jaden nodded, swallowing hard, though no one was around to see it. More people were watching now. Some confused, others filming. The tension buzzed in the air like static before a storm. Jaden hung up the call, but the panic didn't fade. He gripped his sketch pad tighter as a sound in the distance grew louder. Sirens were coming. Red and blue lights sliced through the afternoon haze, dancing across the treetops like an alarm bell no one could unhear. Jaden froze. His sketch pad, clutched tight to his chest, felt like a target painted in bold letters. Gravel crunched under tires as two police cars screeched to a halt near the park's entrance. Doors flung open. Two officers stepped out, hands hovering near their holsters, eyes locked on Jaden. Hands where we can see them, one barked, voice sharp as steel. Jaden's arms shot up so fast he dropped the sketch pad. It hit the pavement with a soft thwack, pages fluttering open to a half-finished drawing of a basketball hoop. His knees wobbled, but he didn't move an inch. Ms. Waverly stepped forward, pointing dramatically like she was directing a stage play. That's him! He was acting aggressive and had something in his hands. It could have been a weapon. The younger officer, blonde with a rigid stance, motioned toward Jaden. Step over here, slowly. Jaden's lips trembled. It wasn't a weapon. It was just a sketch pad. I was drawing. The second officer, taller and older, picked up the pad. He flipped through the pages, brows lifting as he saw pencil drawings of buildings, sneakers, and comic book characters. But his face gave away nothing. Is this your? He asked. Jaden nodded quickly. Yes, sir, I bring it everywhere. They led Ms. Waverly a few feet away. She crossed her arms like she had already won. I didn't overreact, she insisted. He was acting suspicious, and that scooter isn't his. Jaden overheard and turned. It is mine. My uncle bought it for me. He's on his way. Let's stay focused, the older officer said. The younger cop suddenly crouched beside Jaden's backpack. Without asking, he unzipped it and began rifling through notebooks, markers, a half-eaten granola bar. Jaden gasped. You can't just... He clamped his mouth shut, afraid to make it worse. From the corner of the park, people started gathering. Phones were out now. Someone whispered, He's just a kid. Is this really necessary? A jogger asked, his camera rolling. But the officer kept digging, pulling out each item like he expected it to explode. Jaden's fingers curled into fists. His voice cracked. You're looking for something that's not there. The older cop didn't respond. Then just as the younger officer reached into a zippered pouch, a powerful voice sliced through the tension like a thunderclap. Take your hands off my nephew. Heads turned. Jaden's eyes widened. And the crowd? They collectively held their breath. Are you sure this is your scooter? The officer asked, squinting down at Jaden like he was already guilty of something. Jaden's mouth opened, but the words caught in his throat. He nodded slowly, voice soft. Yes, it's mine. But the officer didn't stop. Where'd you get it? You got a receipt. Can someone vouch for you? Jaden blinked, confused. My uncle bought it. For my birthday. He's on his way. From across the park, Ms. Waverly stood smugly, arms folded, lips pursed with quiet satisfaction. She didn't say anything now. She didn't have to. Her expression said it all. She felt justified. The younger officer stepped closer to Jaden, eyeing him like a problem to solve. Mind if I see your ID? I'm 13, Jaden said. I don't have one. There was a beat of silence. The officer's gaze hardened. Phone? Jaden reached into his hoodie pocket, pulling out his phone. His hand trembled as he unlocked the screen. He started dialing again, his thumb hovering over his uncle's name, when the officer snatched the phone out of his hand. Hey! Jaden flinched, stepping back. He's calling me right now. We said stay put, the officer barked, until we figure this out. A few feet away, someone said quietly, This is getting out of hand. A woman in yoga pants raised her phone and started recording. You're treating him like a criminal, another man chimed in. He's a kid, not a suspect. What's wrong with y'all? Jaden stood frozen, his eyes darting between the officer, the crowd, and the scooter lying on its side near the bench. He felt small, exposed, and humiliated. Every second ticked by like an eternity. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not for just sitting in a park. Not for sketching. The officer now thumbed through Jaden's phone like it was his property. "Who's Uncle D?" he muttered. "That's him," Jaden said, barely above a whisper. "That's who I was calling." Ms. Waverly chuckled under her breath. "Just making sure he's not lying," she told a nearby onlooker. A few in the crowd scoffed at her. Then everything stopped. From behind the patrol car, a deep, unmistakable voice rang out, sharp, commanding, and furious. "Take your hands off my nephew." Heads whipped around. Jaden's eyes widened. And there, walking straight toward the chaos, was Big Shaq, face hard as stone, shoulders squared, and every step radiating power. The park went silent. Something had just shifted. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath him. Big Shaq's towering frame stepped out from behind the squad car, casting a long shadow over the scene. His jaw was tight, fists clenched, eyes locked on the officer gripping Jaden's phone. The noise of the park faded into a heavy, pregnant silence. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "What's going on here?" he said, low and steady. But it carried like thunder. The officers stiffened. The older one blinked, his hand instinctively dropping from his belt. Sir, we were responding to a call." Shaq cut him off with a single glance. "That your reason for searching a kid's bag without consent? Grabbing his phone like he's some kind of threat?" Jaden, eyes wide and glassy, broke free from where he'd been frozen and sprinted toward him. "Uncle D!" he choked out, nearly crashing into Shaq's legs. Shaq knelt to his level, one hand resting protectively on Jaden's back. "You okay, little man?" Jaden nodded slowly, still trembling. "I didn't do anything." "You don't have to tell me, I know." The tension in the crowd shifted. Phones were still recording. Whispers spread like wildfire. "That's Shaquille O'Neal." "Oh my God, is that really him? What's he doing here?" Shaq stood tall again, towering over everyone. He turned slowly to Miss Waverly, who now stood as still as a statue. Her earlier confidence drained from her face, replaced with something else. Pure panic. Shaq's stare burned through her like a spotlight. "So," he said, voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Want to repeat what you just told the cops?" Ms. Waverly's lips parted, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted toward the officers, then back to Shaq, desperate for an exit, a shield, anything. But there was none. One of the younger officers cleared his throat, suddenly aware of just how wrong the optics were. "Sir, we had no idea he was your nephew." Shaq didn't blink. "So if he wasn't, this treatment would be okay?" The crowd murmured louder now. Ms. Waverly clutched her purse tighter, her knuckles turning white. Shaq took a step closer, eyes still locked on hers. "You said he made you feel unsafe. You made that call. So let's hear it. Loud enough for everyone." And the entire park leaned in. "You just messed with the wrong family." Shaq's voice echoed across the park like a warning bell. The crowd, once murmuring, now stood dead silent, locked in anticipation. All eyes were on Ms. Waverly, whose bravado had completely crumbled. Her lips quivered as she opened her mouth to respond, but nothing coherent came out. I didn't know he was your nephew," she stammered, her voice brittle. "This is all just a misunderstanding." Shaq didn't flinch. He pulled out his phone, tapped a button, and held it up for everyone to hear. Jaden's voice played over the speaker. "Hey, Uncle D, just wanted to say I'm at the park. There's this lady here who keeps staring at me and asking questions. I told her I was waiting for you, but she's calling the cops now. Can you come quick?" The audio ended. No one spoke. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "She lied." Straight up lied. Cameras were already recording, and now even more people pulled out their phones, capturing every second. Miss Waverly's eyes darted toward the officers, searching for backup, but they looked just as uncomfortable now. One of them shifted awkwardly. The younger officer muttered, "We didn't know any of this, sir." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "No, you didn't ask. You assumed." The sergeant, a stocky man with graying hair and a clipboard under his arm, stepped forward. He took a long breath, eyes scanning the growing crowd, the phones, the headlines practically writing themselves. "Sir, we take allegations seriously." Shaq's hand shot up, silencing him without a word. "Don't spin this," he said calmly. "You were about to cuff a 13-year-old boy for holding a sketch pad. If I hadn't shown up, what would have happened? Who would have listened to his story then?" The sergeant blinked, then turned to Miss Waverly, whose face had gone ghost pale. Sweat glistened at her temple. Her hands clenched her purse like it could shield her from the fallout. Shaq took one step forward, his presence commanding. So I'll ask, one last time, you gonna fix this? Or should I? The sergeant looked from Shaq to Jaden, then to the sea of phones aimed at them like live ammunition. He exhaled sharply and turned to Miss Waverly. Ma'am, he said, his tone formal now, we need to speak to you privately. Right now. The park erupted in hushed whispers. Ms. Waverly's eyes widened, because she wasn't walking away from this. Ms. Waverly didn't expect herself to be questioned, but now the spotlight was on her, and it was blinding. As soon as the sergeant motioned for her to stay, Ms. Waverly instinctively took a step back. I think I've said enough, she mumbled, gripping her purse like it was a lifeline. She tried to pivot, making a move toward the sidewalk, but two officers blocked her path. Ma'am, we're not done, the sergeant said sternly. We need to clarify a few things. Her face flushed. Clarify what? I called because I felt threatened. That's not a crime. You said the boy was armed, the sergeant replied, pulling out his notepad. What weapon did you see? Ms. Waverly stuttered. I thought I saw something. Maybe it was his phone, or the sketch pad. It was dark. Well, shady? You said he was aggressive. How exactly? The officer asked again. I don't know. He looked like he might run up on me, she snapped, voice rising. He just didn't seem like he belonged here. That sentence lingered in the air like poison. Shaq took a step forward, his voice low but heavy with meaning. You didn't see a threat. You saw skin. Let's not pretend it was anything else. A few people gasped. One older woman nearby nodded slowly and said aloud, Exactly that. Another young man muttered, Happens all the time. The crowd grew denser, more people joining in, phones still raised, the tension now turning into something electric, justice hanging in the balance. Ms. Waverly looked around, suddenly aware of just how many people were witnessing her unravel. I didn't mean to escalate anything, she tried again, but her tone had lost all authority. I thought I was doing the right thing. Shaq didn't even look at her now. His focus was on Jaden, who was standing close by, his shoulders finally starting to relax. It's never the right thing when the first instinct is fear. And it's never the right instinct when it only shows up for kids who look like him. The sergeant said nothing. He just scribbled something in his pad and gave a small nod. Just then, a woman with a camera crew pushed through the crowd. Her mic had the logo of a local news station. She raised her hand. Shaquille? Mind giving a quick statement? Shaq looked at Jaden, then at the crowd, then back at the mic. And with that, this private injustice was about to go very public. What happened in that park wasn't just a moment. It was about to become a movement, and it all started with one interview. The camera rolled, the red light blinking steadily as Shaq stepped forward. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with restrained fury. Jaden stood beside him, silent and gripping his sketch pad tightly to his chest, like a shield. The reporter held out her mic. Mr. O'Neill, can you tell us what happened here today? Shaq exhaled slowly, then nodded. Yeah. A young black boy was harassed, profiled, and treated like a criminal for sitting in a park, drawing, minding his business. The reporter tried to follow up, but Shaq continued, his voice cutting through the air with clarity and weight. This wasn't about safety. This was about fear. Fear built on skin, not facts. And the call she made? That could have gone very wrong, very fast. The crowd around him stayed still, quiet. Phones recorded from every angle. Mothers held their kids closer. One older man whispered, About time someone said it out loud. Jaden's eyes scanned the faces, strangers who now stood in solidarity. Still overwhelmed, he said nothing, but his presence, his silence, spoke volumes. Within minutes, the footage hit Twitter, then Instagram, then TikTok. Their park Karen began trending within the hour. The clip of Miss Waverly describing Jaden as possibly armed while he clutched colored pencils triggered outrage. Comment sections exploded. Influencers shared their own stories. Celebrities retweeted the video. One user posted, This kid could have been the next Trayvon. Thank God for Shaq. Meanwhile, Ms. Waverly's face, captured clearly in multiple angles, spread like wildfire. People began sleuthing, trying to find out who she was. And it didn't take long. A tweet broke through the noise with a screenshot from a school website. Is this the same Ms. Waverly who teaches third grade at Brook Hill Elementary? It was. People were stunned. A teacher, comments turned venomous. She teaches kids but calls cops on them in public. This is who's shaping young minds? Shaq stayed quiet on social media. He didn't need to post. The video said everything. And Jaden, though still processing, began to realize this was bigger than the park. As the sun dipped below the horizon and news vans pulled away, Shaq's phone buzzed with a message. He showed it to Jaden. A single sentence lit up the screen. Your name's trending nationwide. And below that, another notification. Brook Hill Elementary puts Miss Waverly on leave, pending investigation. The real storm had just begun. The internet doesn't forget, and it definitely doesn't forgive. Ms. Waverly was about to learn that the hard way. By the next morning, the school's inbox was flooded. Hundreds of emails, thousands of comments, phone lines jammed. Parents demanded answers, and they weren't subtle. How can we trust our children with someone like her? One voicemail said. Another email read simply, fire her now. Brook Hill Elementary tried to contain the firestorm, but it was too late. Local news crews had staked out the campus gates. Students whispered in the halls. Teachers kept glancing at their phones. Everyone had seen the video. Everyone had heard her call Jaden aggressive and possibly armed. And now everyone knew she worked with children. Meanwhile, Shaq didn't stay silent. Jaden's school, different from Brook Hill, reached out within hours. They invited Shaq to speak at a student assembly on racial bias, asking him to help educate not just the students, but the faculty too. He agreed without hesitation. We can't undo what happened in that park, he told the principal, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again. At the same time, Ms. Waverly finally broke her silence. She posted a short apology video online. It was stiff, rehearsed, and painfully hollow. I didn't mean to cause harm, she said, blinking too much. It was all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to protect my community. The comments were brutal. Protect it from a 13-year-old with a sketch pad? Nah, you were protecting your prejudice. No one was buying what she was selling. The school district placed her on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. But to the public, she was already gone. Meanwhile, Jaden sat quietly at his kitchen table, sketchpad open. His pencil moved with intention, capturing the park. The moment the sirens arrived, the fear in his own eyes, and then the silhouette of Shaq standing behind him like a mountain, strong, unmoving. That drawing, raw, emotional, powerful, was posted by a family friend. It exploded online. Thousands shared it. News anchors displayed it on air. A prominent gallery offered to feature it in a youth exhibit. Jaden's pain had become a piece of art the world couldn't ignore. Shaq watched the attention grow, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Then, without saying a word, he reached for his phone. He scrolled, tapped a name, and brought it to his ear. Yo, he said, we need to do something bigger for this kid. You in? A voice on the other end replied, say the word. Shaq leaned back in his chair, a grin forming. This kid's about to change the world. Shaq wasn't just out to defend his nephew. He was about to light a fuse that would turn one ugly moment into a citywide movement. 3 days later, Shaq sat across from the board of a local nonprofit, Arts Rise, his voice low but firm. I'm not just here to talk, he said, sliding a check across the table. I'm here to fund the future. The board members stared at the amount. One gasped. Shaq continued. We're starting an arts scholarship in Jaden's name. Full ride. For kids like him. Ones with talent, but no spotlight. Within hours, the program was official. The Jaden Lewis Arts Initiative. But Shaq wasn't done. He partnered with local businesses to send art kits, real ones, not cheap crayons and dollar store pads, to underserved schools across the city. Each box came with a note, create like the world is watching, JL. The city responded. Teachers cried. Parents shared photos. Kids held up their first ever sketchbooks like trophies. And Jaden, he sat quietly at the center of it all, unsure whether to feel proud or overwhelmed. Then came the invitation. A prestigious youth arts expo reached out, asking Jaden to submit his sketch, the one that captured the park moment that started everything. They wanted it as the main feature. Jaden hesitated. What if people don't see what I saw? He asked Shaq, eyes filled with doubt. They will, Shaq replied, because they felt it. That weekend, at a city press event, the mayor stood at a podium, hand on Jaden's shoulder. This young man turned pain into purpose, the mayor said, and this city is better because of it. The applause echoed through City Hall, and while Jaden was being honored, Miss Waverly's chapter was quietly closed. An internal memo confirmed what most expected. Her contract would not be renewed. No press conference, no statements, just silence. But Jaden didn't need her name mentioned anymore. His was the one that mattered now. Later that night, after all the cameras were gone and the noise had quieted, Shaq and Jaden sat on a rooftop overlooking the skyline, stars scattered like paint flecks in the dark. "You did good, kid," Shaq said, his voice softer than usual. Jaden looked down, unsure how to take it all in. Shaq smiled, reached over, and gently nudged his shoulder. "You ready for the next level?" Jaden looked up, a slow smile forming on his face. "Yeah," he said, eyes lighting up. "Let's go even bigger." A year ago, Jaden was mistaken for a threat. Today, he's the voice everyone wants to hear. The auditorium pulsed with energy. Spotlights swept across the packed crowd as young students, teachers, and city leaders filled every seat. On the main screen, Jaden's face flashed alongside the words, "Citywide Youth Summit, featuring Jaden Lewis." Backstage, Jaden stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his blazer. He wasn't the same shy kid who once sat sketching under a tree. Today, he was an ambassador for anti-bias education, speaking at schools across the country. His artwork now hung in two major galleries, one piece titled "Misjudged Silence," still making rounds on social media. But even with the accolades, nerves fluttered in his chest. Shaq leaned against the wall nearby, arms folded, watching the teen like a proud older brother. He didn't say much these days, he didn't have to. "You ready?" he asked. Jaden took a breath and nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." Ms. Waverly's name hadn't come up in months. After being removed from the school district, she faded into obscurity. No job, no interviews, no presence. She had vanished like a bad memory the city chose to delete. Jaden didn't talk about her anymore. He didn't need to. He walked toward the curtain, heart racing, footsteps echoing louder with every step. A staff member held out a mic, and as Jaden reached for it, another voice stopped him cold. "There's one more surprise," the stagehand whispered, handing him a small envelope with gold trim. Jaden stared at it. "From who?" The woman just smiled. "You'll see." Confused, Jaden tucked the envelope into his jacket and stepped onto the stage. Applause erupted the moment the spotlight hit him. Camera flashes sparked. A wave of chants swept the room. "Jaden! Jaden!" He approached the podium, blinking against the lights. As the cheers faded, he cleared his throat. "A year ago, I thought my art was just mine. A way to escape. A way to hide. But that day in the park, I realized silence doesn't protect us. Voice does." The crowd hung on to every word. Even Shaq, now seated in the front row, couldn't hide his emotion. Jaden reached into his pocket and opened the envelope. Inside was a key. Below it, a note in Shaq's handwriting. "Your own studio. First one opens next month. Paint the world, kid." Jaden looked up, eyes wide. He wasn't just about to speak. He was about to create something bigger than ever before. Jaden stepped onto the stage, expecting to give a speech. But what he saw stopped him cold and changed everything. The auditorium lights dimmed to a golden hue, casting a warm glow over the crowd. Jaden stepped forward, adjusting the mic, heart thudding like a drumbeat in his chest. His palms were sweaty, but his grip on the note cards remained firm. Then, without warning, the massive LED screen behind him flickered to life. A single image appeared, bold, raw, and achingly familiar. It was his sketch. The sketch. Jaden's art, the one he had drawn the day after the park incident, filled the screen. It showed a boy sitting on a bench, clutching a sketch pad, while towering figures loomed over him. But the boy wasn't small. He glowed with light, defiant, surrounded by shadows trying, but failing, to consume him. The crowd went still. Then, like a tidal wave, a standing ovation erupted. Jaden stood frozen. His throat tightened. His lips trembled. He hadn't expected this. Not today. Not like this. From the side of the stage, Shaq emerged, slow and steady, wearing a suit that somehow made him look even larger than life. He walked over, gently placing a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "This young man," Shaq said, voice echoing through the hall, "turned pain into purpose, fear into fuel, silence into something louder than any siren that day." He paused as the applause surged again. "And today we're announcing a nationwide youth arts tour featuring Jaden's work, created by him, telling his story, and the stories of so many others who've been silenced. The spotlight shifted back to Jaden, who blinked through a wave of tears. He looked out at the sea of faces, some crying, some smiling, all standing for him. His hands no longer shook. He didn't need the note cards. "I thought that day in the park would be something I'd try to forget," Jaden began, his voice steady now. "But you can't erase who you are. You can only draw something bigger over it." He looked up at the screen behind him once more. "And to the woman who thought I didn't belong," he paused, exhaling with quiet power. "Turns out, I wasn't just part of the picture." He stepped back from the mic, letting the moment breathe. "I am the canvas." The lights dimmed as the crowd erupted again. Cheers, applause, thunderous praise. And Jaden stood in the center, no longer the kid who was profiled, judged, or underestimated. He was the future, painted bold, framed in truth, and impossible to ignore.